Where is the Yellow Fringe? William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in the Herveo municipality of the department of Tolima. Where is the Yellow Fringe? A short time ago a dear American friend confessed to me her amazement at the situation in Colombia. I don't understand, he told me, with the country that you have, with the talent of its people, why Colombia is so cornered by the social crisis, why is it experiencing such a dramatic situation of increasing violence, why there is so much injustice, so much inequity, so much impunity. What is the cause of all this? For a moment I was about to try and answer, but so many things crowded me that I didn't even know how to begin. I felt that even if I spoke without interruption the entire night, I would not be able to fully convey the explanations that I continually give myself, trying to understand the complex country to which I belong. On the other hand, I understood that many of my explanations would not have liked my friend, or would have put her in conflict with her own version of reality. It is frequent for us to hear from generous lips the regret of these misfortunes and the amazement at our inability to resolve them. The first issue, then, is to wonder if Colombian society is really experiencing an exceptionally tragic situation, if this reality is so different from that of the rest of the countries, or at least of the so-called third world countries. My answer is yes. Colombia is today the country with the highest crime rate on the planet, and insecurity is turning its streets into a no-man's land. It has half of its population in conditions of extreme poverty, and at the same time presence in its ruling class levels of opulence that are difficult to exaggerate. It shows one of the most disturbing state inefficiencies on the continent, alongside good rates of economic growth. It shows strong tax levels and extremely high levels of corruption in the administration. It shows astonishing conditions of impunity and paralysis of justice, and at the same time a high investment in security, as well as very high costs for citizens in maintaining the military apparatus. It shows the most deplorable conditions of helplessness for almost all citizens, and yet it is a country where complaints are not heard, where protest and citizen mobilization practically do not exist, a kind of protracted disaster in silent movies. The latter is staggering. The visible passivity of Colombian society alarms visitors. In the recent strikes that shocked France, it was possible to see how a society that lives relatively well in economic terms and protected by a responsible state, knows how to react as a whole to everything that injures it, does not allow its rights to be trampled on, and resists the privileges it has won or undermined. Seeing the French marching through the streets, setting up barricades before a government whose legitimacy they do not ignore, and shaking the institutions, confirms that France is the country of the revolution, that this country is respectable because it has pride and because it has dignity, because it knows what it is capable of when its leaders forget that they are paid by the people and that they are only the representatives of their will. Given this example, it becomes more incomprehensible that a society like Colombia's, where not even the fabulously wealthy sectors can feel satisfied, because the state they support no longer even guarantees their lives, where no one is protected, where the state does not fulfill its obligations, elementary duties, and where outrageous things happen every day, is so incapable of expressing himself, of demanding, of imposing changes, of even collaborating with his pressure or with his anger to the transformations that we all need. What is it that makes Colombia a country capable of withstanding all infamy, incapable of reacting and making its presence felt, its greatness? Many venture the hypothesis that this apparent poverty of spirit and this weakness of character are due to the biological and genetic characteristics of the population. It would therefore be the expression of an ineluctable fatality. Others hold the same with regard to crime rates. They would reveal an incurable disease, and would make us a poor people without salvation and without remedy. But the truth is that our rates of violence and our current political ineptitude are historical facts that can be explained. Furthermore, it would seem that the explanations are so obvious and even so simple that stupidity or malevolence is required to venture fatalistic opinions. No sensible person would argue that by having precipitated the death of 50 million beings in 5 years in conditions of scandalous cruelty and brutality, European society reveals a sinister and incurable pathology. No sensible person would argue that because American society has sacrificed 500,000 people in 3 years of war to prevent its own secession and then encouraged the secession of Panama to become the most important interoceanic canal in the world, that there is participated in the wars in Nicaragua, dropped atomic bombs on Japanese cities, invaded Vietnam, supported the worst dictators in the Caribbean and Central America, and bombed Baghdad, that means that the Americans suffer from some irreparable aggressive monomania. Historians will come to our aid to explain the precise historical conditions that led those societies and their governments to participate in these rugged realities. Colombia is going through dramatic moments, but the one who helps at least is the one who declares, out of impatience, despair, or bad faith, that these circumstances are final, or that they are due to ungovernable causes. Rather, I would say that what we are experiencing is the unleashing of numerous damned problems that our society never faced with courage and sensibility, and history does not allow injustices to go away because we do not solve them. When a society is not capable of carrying out the reforms that the social order demands for its continuity in time, history solves them in its own way, sometimes at very high costs for everyone. And the truth is that Colombia has postponed for too long the reflection on its destiny, the definition of its national project, the decision on the place it wants to occupy in the world arena. It has postponed too long the reforms that the nation's foremost sons have called for, one after another, since the time of independence. Almost all of them were sacrificed for meanness and greed, and today the list of lucid and clairvoyant Colombians who dreamed of a great and just country, a country affirmed in its territory, respectful of its diversity, committed to a project is long and melancholic. Truly democratic, capable of being worthy of their wealth and uniqueness, and that they paid with their life, their loneliness, or their exile for having been faithful to those dreams. If there is something that nobody ignores, it is that the country is in very bad hands. Those who claim to be representatives of the national will are for the great majority of the population people who are untrustworthy, mere businessmen, living people who do not identify with the country and who do not seek its greatness. But this is not new. If something characterized our society since the days of independence, it is that the possibility of breaking with the old colonial schemes was systematically frustrated here. Colombia remained prostrate in the veneration of illustrious cultural models, it continued to feel like a marginal province of history, it continued to discriminate against its Indians and its blacks, being ashamed of its racial complexity, its geography, its nature. This was not a mere distraction, it was the result of the blocking of those who were never interested in having this work done. From the beginning there were those who knew what our duties were if we wanted to build a fairly just homeland and prevent Colombia from becoming in the long run the incredible nest of injustices, atrocities, and cynicisms that it has become. We could not say that it was due to a lack of historical perspective that we did not realize how important it is for a society to recognize itself in its territory, explore its nature, become aware of its social and cultural composition, and develop a project that, without confusing them, brings together its nationals in some common tasks, in a historical solidarity company. I always think about what we did not do in time when I remember those beautiful verses that Robert Frost read in The Possession of John Kennedy, where he declares the key to the destiny of the United States, how that country that is historically our contemporary fulfilled a task that we have not yet fulfilled. This land was ours before we were from this earth. It was our more than a century before we become his people. It was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia. But we were settlers from England, owning things that did not yet possess us, possessed of what we no longer possessed. Something that we refused to give used up our strength, until we understood that that something was ourselves, that we did not give ourselves to the soil in which we lived, and from that moment it was our salvation to give ourselves. The history of Colombia is the history of a prolonged postponement of the only adventure worth living, one by which Colombians truly take possession of our territory, become aware of our nature. One of the most beautiful and privileged in the world, let us become aware of the magnificent complexity of our ethnic and cultural composition, we create firm ties that unite the population in a common pride and a common project, and we commit ourselves to being a country, and not a nest of exclusions. and discords where a few privileged, deeply ashamed of the country from which they derive their wealth, they preach day and night a mean discourse of contempt or indifference for the people they never knew how to honor or magnify, who always seemed to them a country of Kafirs, a subaltern species of barbarism and ugliness. The first betrayal of this national dream was carried out by the old merchants who, concerned only with their private interests, imposed themselves on the government of the young republic to block any possibility of an independent economy, and allowed the country to remain a mere producer of raw materials for the great world industry and an unrestricted consumer of foreign manufactures. Just as our colonial societies had provided the metropolises with the wealth with which they built their fabulous cities and developed their industrial revolution, so our access to the Republic did not prevent us from continuing to be the servile troops of those hegemonic economies, and there was always between us powerful sectors interested in us not ceasing to be so. This paid off for them. There was always an arrogant and simulative parish aristocracy that tried to live as in the metropolis, enjoying the pride of being better than the rest, of not resembling others, of not identifying with the necessary but deplored country in which they lived. I have never stopped wondering why those who profit the most from the country are the ones who are most ashamed of it, and I remember with deep perplexity the day when one of the sons of a former president of the Republic confessed to me that the first song in Spanish I had heard it when I was 20 years old. There I understood in the hands of what kind of people this country has been for decades. Those village princes with the vocation of viceroys only went out to visit it when it was necessary to resort to the infectious crowd to obtain or buy the votes. Also from the beginning, despite the fact that there have been very few cases of wars between nations on this continent, a tradition of privileges was generated for the military establishment, because the governments, which almost always neglected the fate of the humble crowds, needed an arm. Strong and steady hand when it comes to warding off rebellions. And this is in its reasonable way, because when an irresponsible and anti-popular regime is built, force is absolutely necessary to maintain, at any cost, a social order or disorder that the people would hardly defend as their own. Who is unaware here that the great majorities of Colombia have nothing to thank the state as it is constituted, and that for that reason they are not as willing as in other countries to hand over their youth to it? It is sad to remember that for a long time the privileged classes, those most defended by the state, paid to free their children from the military service that the poor had to fulfill irremediably. And it is true that young people deplore having to go to an army whose main function is to confront their own people. Every state has to demonstrate its legitimacy, its care for the people, to deserve the adherence and loyalty of its people, and it is an axiom that if the people are not patriotic it is because the state does not set a good example. Great historical efforts attempted to fulfill the imperative task of asserting itself in a tradition and building a homeland. Among the first and most valuable was the botanical expedition, which began to reveal to the world the exuberance of our tropical flora and which awakened in a generation the surprising pride of belonging to the unexplored tropics of America. One of the consequences of that expedition was the independence movement, but the reconquest frustrated the patient work of so many wise men and artists, and 2 centuries later the botanical expedition remains an unfinished work. Colombia has, according to its fame, the greatest diversity of birds in the world, but it is so unaware of its riches that the most complete book on the varieties of Colombian birds, Birds of Colombia, is not translated into Spanish. In the second half of the 19th century, the Chorographic Commission undertook its tasks, and yet even today Colombia continues to be a country without a territorial project, without a sensible and proper development plan, without a census taking advantage of its resources. The state, omnipotent when it comes to imposing taxes and repressing discontent, is itself powerless when it comes to preventing looting, moderating depredations and protecting heritage. And this because in reality it is not a state that represents a national will, and that can rely on it for those great decisions that demand on behalf of all to curb the greed of a few, but that it represents only petty interests and is made to defend them, sometimes even fiercely. It is true that great external powers have always been interested in keeping our economy in disadvantageous conditions, which would allow them to conduct their business here on the best terms. For the great world industry it was a priority to guarantee its supply of raw materials, and to maintain here a privileged class in a position to consume imported products. One of the truths that I could not explain clearly to my friend is why and in what way the North American government always supported the Colombian supporters of free trade, who opened our borders to their products, and even always sponsored one of the sides in the civil wars that tore Colombia apart during the 19th century. She will feel the strangeness that Colombians are unhappy, but she will hardly understand that we have not been alone in the construction of our hardship, that many times her own state participated in the preparation and design of our current chaos. When it was thought that the urgent Central American Interoceanic Canal would pass through Nicaragua, the United States sponsored the adventure of William Walker and was quick to recognize his incredible rule of mercenaries. Only the indignant clamor of the continent prevented Nicaragua from becoming, by way of the blow, another state of the North American Union, and forced the United States to back down from its hasty diplomatic recognition. It was soon decided that the canal would be Panamanian, and the United States, our caring continental older brother, who had just lived through a gigantic and terrible war to prevent a segregation in its sacred territory, financed the segregation of Panama and obtained in exchange the construction and administration of the Interoceanic Canal for a century. However, how can we blame other countries for defending their interests and thinking first of all about their convenience? This is what the world market is pompously called, a game of cunning and robbery disguised by a syrupy language, sometimes technical and pragmatic, sometimes bombastic and cynical. What is worthy of reproach is that there are national governments that in this context work to favor the interests of others and not those of their own country. And from the early days of the Republic there were those governments here, highly respected and loved abroad, who handed over our economy to the interests of the great powers and did not allow the emergence of a local industry, of a market, internal, and decent living standards for the population. Always the syrupy speech based our happiness on the ability to compete freely, which meant surrendering our economy without protection and without scruples to the rigors and rapacity of the world market. This genius invention has been called economic openness since the days of General Francisco de Paula Santander, a member and supporter of the great families of importing merchants from the savannah. The civil wars of the 19th century defeated liberal thought, radicalism, and the enlightened tradition of the democratic sectors, and finally imposed a centralized clerical aristocratic regime whose constitution, promulgated in 1886, ruled the country for more than 100 years. This regime made Colombia one of the most conservative countries on the continent. Despite the liberal efforts of Manuel Murillo Toro, of Tomás Cipriano de Mosquera, of José Hilario López, who had decreed the freedom of slaves in 1854, before the United States, despite great democratic struggles, Colombian society was closed under the power of the landowners and the clergy, the church and the state were confused in an undifferentiated and nefarious amalgam, the Catholic Index prohibited free reading for much of the century, education was managed by the church, and elementary conquests of liberal society such as civil marriage and divorce, conquests that all neighboring countries have possessed for more than 60 years, are achievements that Colombian society came to obtain at the end of the 20th century, showing itself as one of the most closed and dark social schemes in the West. This gave rise to tremendous pictures of family violence and social intolerance, an enormous disrespect for the beliefs of others, and the persistent tendency to consider all dissent and all rebellion as a religious phenomenon. The mid-century civil war, known as La Violencia, was configured as an immense religious war, made of fanaticism and brutal blindness, and reached aberrant extremes, with the recognized presence of the Church as one of its main instigators. Around 1930, after 50 years, the conservative hegemony was weakened by popular discontent, union struggles intensified, there were outbreaks of rebellion, and finally the scandalous massacre of the banana companies precipitated the discredit of the conservative regime. A sector of liberalism led by Alfonso López Pumarejo attempted a democratic reform that would favor industrialization, that would modify the property regime on land, that would modify the relations between the state and the church, and that would open the way for the adaptation of society Colombia to some of the world trends of the century. It was not, of course, the structural reform that the country needed, nor the vast awareness of the need for a different order, nor the great effort to dignify a society malformed by exclusion and social stratification. It was a moderate reform, but naturally it unleashed an immediate counter-reform, which brought illiberal violence to the fields and began to sow the germ of some future evils. The intolerant feudal country was resisting change, and its reaction aroused new dissatisfaction. As a response to the anti-liberal violence, the popular sector of liberalism undertook a defense of the persecuted peasants, which quickly became a huge popular rebellion under the guidance of the caudillo Jorge Eliar Gayton. Gayton understood very early that Colombia urgently needed major social reforms, and the national project that was always postponed became his banner. He belonged to the Liberal Party, but he understood that the main enemy of Colombian society was that aristocratic bipartisanship whose leaders actually formed a single two-sided party, made to loot the country and benefit from it behind the backs of the majorities, and in his speeches he advanced towards a reformulation of the political crisis as the conflict between the humble and authentic majorities, and the paltry country of privileges. Speaking of the political country and the national country, highlighting the way in which the leaders governed for a minority, he conquered an unexpected electoral flow, and suddenly the old ruling class was faced with a phenomenon of popular enthusiasm unknown in Colombia. The campaign of slander and defamation unleashed by the mainstream press failed to weaken the Gaytonista movement, and the old breed understood that, like the bow of the legendary Nordic king, Norway was going to break in his hands. The ruling class, headed by the political bosses and the great power-holding newspapers, now relied only on the ignorance and indiscipline of the Gaytonista hosts, the country of Kafirs which they had always despised. It was then that Gayton called the March of Silence, to protest the violence in the fields, and an impressive Gaytonista crowd overwhelmed Bogotá by marching and concentrating in a disciplined and silent way. Those people showed that they were not a vociferous hydra, that they could be a powerful and calm force, and this exasperated the owners of the country. From that moment on, Gayton was the head of the greatest popular force in our history and, according to the democratic order, he was the sure president of the republic. He would come to power not only with great popular support but with enormous clarity about the reforms we required and about the country that Colombia should become to prevent the loss of millions of human beings. Gayton must have sensed that a dehumanized development model would be capable of sacrificing the peasants of Colombia, who were the majority of the population, to favor without mitigating the blind designs of a savage capitalism. As mayor of Bogotá, he had set the official value of working hours in public places, to give workers an idea of their dignity and rights. As Minister of Education he tried unsuccessfully to open the way to a radical educational reform that would respond to the needs of the growing country. It is still possible to hear in his speeches his interest in preventing an economy of privilege from plunging Colombia into pauperization and the crushing of the poorest people. His enemies then understood that democracy would bring Gayton to power and proceeded to offer their support in exchange for him accepting their advice, that is, sharing his triumph with them and allowing them to escort him. Gayton refused, and they intensified in their smear campaign. The last wave of that rabid opposition must have armed the fanatic or mercenary hand that killed him. And thus began the gigantic counter-revolution, or anti-revolution, since it conspired something that had not yet been accomplished, that tragically marked the fate of Colombia in the following 50 years. This counter-revolution had 3 stages, each one worse than the last. The first was the assassination of the caudillo, which caused the capital to be burned. The second was the violence of the 1950s, which depopulated the fields of Colombia and made cities grow dramatically with millions of displaced people thrown into misery. The third was the aristocratic pact of the National Front, through which the instigators of violence benefited from it and divided power for 20 years, outlawing all opposition, closing the path of access to wealth for the enterprising middle classes, and keeping the poor in conditions of extreme helplessness while increasing their own capital to the obscene. April 9, 1948 was the darkest date of the century for Colombia. Not because in it, as the old powers claim, the continuity of our social order was broken, but because that day was confirmed in a dramatic way. The structure of the Gaytonista movement, with its subjection to the figure and the thought of the caudillo, allowed the dismemberment and dissolution of that adventure in which the future of the country was encrypted. Gaydon was clear about the need for a national project that encompasses the entire country, a nation of whites and mestizos, blacks and immigrants that could reconcile with the spirit of the native peoples of the territory, and extract from that complexity a unique way of being in the world. But that clarity led him to confront naively, that is, in a courageous, sincere and unarmed way, that ruling class that profited from the national misery and that profoundly despised everything that did not fit in its petty orbit of privileges. A caste of mestizos with fortune that had never tried to be Colombian, nor to identify with our geography, with our nature, with our population, that he was continually ashamed, as he continues to do today, of this world's so little resemblance to the idolized European world. A deplorable elite that traveled to Europe and North America, not to proudly carry the message of a people dignified by respect and affirmed in their territory, but to pretend to be European, and to try by the most servile methods to be accepted by a world that does not. He was ignorant of their Rasta-leather status and lack of character. Gaydon's speech deserves many reflections. It is singular that in a country puffed up by the rhetoric of its grammarians and academics, it was a man of humble origins who ennobled the language of politics, who, exhibiting great syntactic refinement and remarkable clarity of thought, has had an echo in a supposedly ignorant and savage people. We cannot forget that the great undertaking of renewing the Castilian language and converting it into an American language had also been led by a Nicaraguan Indian, Rubén Darío, and that the great Colombian poetry of that time was being written by a son of peasants from Santa Rosa de Osos who had practically never been to school. This seems astonishing, but it is natural. Language, like religious sentiment, is the daughter of the peoples, they are its creators and its transformers, and the academies, like the ecclesiastics, are nothing more than the greedy administrators of a treasure that they do not always understand. What seemed to be insinuating itself on the horizon of Gaydonismo was a kind of national revolution, a transformation of the ideology that reigned through the power of the parties in the soul of the people, and the formation of a large band of opinion capable of leading not only Gaydon to the presidency but also the country to a new beginning. What countries like Mexico had partially conquered, whose identification with themselves, whose respect for native roots, whose affirmation in their own people, in their music, in their gastronomy, in their clothing, in their traditions, were an example for the bewildered mestizo continent, and whose revolution, undoubtedly full of errors and painful and tragic events, had nevertheless conferred a deep sense of pride and dignity on its people. As is often the case with assassinations, the murder of Gaydon has been presented to us as the solitary crime of an alienated person or a fanatic. What we cannot ignore is the social and political climate in which the event took place, the sectors visibly interested in the disappearance of the leader, and those who benefit from it. If the hand that killed him was a fanatic or a mercenary, it is something indifferent. The obvious cause of the crime was the smear campaign carried out against him by the mainstream press, which showed him as a danger to society, as someone who came to destroy the country, and that he caricatured him as a savage at the head of a band of cannibals. The crime produced throughout the country a spontaneous uprising made of frustration and despair, but incapable of great purposes and even of setting noble immediate tasks. Amid fires and robbery and havoc, the people understood that once again their hopes had died, and perhaps they also understood that the prevailing power would never allow a transformation of society through the democratic and peaceful ways that Gaydon had chosen. But the second phase of that powerful counter-revolution also began there, because, warned of the danger of a popular movement, the traditional political parties set out to reconquer their hosts and made an effort to counteract the effects of Gaydon's speech. To this end, they radicalized their partisan language, magnified a tangle of rhetorical differences between the two parties, and using all resources and all means of influence, they fanatized the naive peasant population. Perhaps they did not intend to unleash a wave of violence, but the criminal and irresponsible way in which they stoked the bonfires of hatred to win the loyalty of their proselytes condemns forever the leaders of both parties who precipitated Colombia in the most sinister time of its life. History. Humble people who had known each other all their lives, who had grown up together, were suddenly compelled to respond to old unburied hatreds, and without knowing how, without knowing why, without the slightest benefit, they allowed themselves to be carried away by the incredible power from the factious rhetoric that bombarded them from the stands, from the pulpits and from the mainstream media, and the carnage began. Between 1945 and 1965, Colombia experienced a veritable orgy of blood that bleakly marked its future. Even more astonishing is that those who precipitated the country into that horror are the same ones who continue to direct it, those whose speech is the only one that prevails in society, those who refuse to understand that although they have become unspeakably rich, they have failed before the history, that they had the country in their hands for more than a century and that the result of their way of thinking and acting is this that we have before us. Violence, chaos, corruption, insecurity, cowardice, misery, and the misery of millions of human beings. Fortunately, it is no longer necessary to exhaust oneself in arguments to demonstrate the failure of the two parties and their elites, it is enough to show the country that we have. Once, with sad irony, the English historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote that the presence of armed men is a natural part of the Colombian landscape, like the hills and rivers. It is certainly difficult to find times in history in which our fields have not been the scene of men in arms, and Hobsbawm himself has said that the Colombian violence of the 1950s represented one of the largest mobilizations of armed civilians in the Western Hemisphere in the 20th century. The hosts of Mexican revolutionaries toured their country fighting for the land and freedom that Emiliano Zapata preached to them. It is sad to see that the men in arms of mid-century in Colombia were not fighting for any popular demand, but instigated by powers that had always despised them, and when they began to fight for something of their own, it was out of a spirit of revenge, to claim their injuries that same war had waged on them. The conservative government had politicized the police, had released the sinister Chole Vida to harass liberals. These in turn reacted by arming themselves, and began to see an enemy in every conservative. The cause of that was in the power and in the preachers of hatred, but very soon each one had their own arguments to continue the retaliation. For the chains of resentment, it is enough to start, everything else will happen of its own accord. 10 years after those first hostilities and aggressions, the violence had already manufactured its own monsters, and a general climate of terror and impunity bore the most insane fruits. The names of Sparks, of Desquite, of Tarzan, of Captain Venom, of Sangre Negra, still freeze our blood, and only very recently have the electric mountains of Trujillo come to equal the heights of horror and human depravity that were lived then in Colombia. They always told us that the violence of the 1950s was a violence between liberals and conservatives. That is not true. It was violence between poor liberals and poor conservatives, while the rich and powerful of both parties incited them and financed their rancor, showing signs of infinite social irresponsibility. La Violencia could not be a popular initiative, since it was not directed against those who always profited from the people. It was rather the ancient story of the poor killing each other with the boss's speech on their lips. A persistent and poisonous source of hatred flowed from somewhere and fed the moral misery of the country. The leaders, those who still dictate to public opinion at night what it will respond to tomorrow in the polls, pretended not to notice what was the cause of this generalized bleeding, and without ceasing to preach hatred of the Goth and the Red, they complained of the savagery of the people. The truth is that it was enough for Alberto Lleras and Laureano Gomez to embrace and agree on the alliance so that the vast Colombian violence ceased to be a generalized chaos and was reduced to the final persecution of gangs of debased murderers. Now, if the violence had been a war, who won it? Apparently no one. But if we judge by the next phase of the drama, the result is unquestionable. Out of 300,000 dead peasants, the bipartisanship had triumphed. As happens at the end of all wars, a pact was signed on the still smoking fields of violence, and that pact was called the National Front, by which the two irreconcilable parties became one with two colors and the same ideology. And they shared power for 20 years. In the name of bipartisanship, the people had waged war on themselves. Now the representatives of the old ruling class that had been the main promoter of violence would succeed themselves in power. Thus the third phase of that implacable counter-revolution was consummated. Liberalism and conservatism would have no problem sharing power, and the reforms Gayton had promised could be postponed until the end of the world. After a war and 300,000 deaths, Colombia should continue to be the inauthentic, mean, anti-popular and exclusive country that it was 20 years ago, and the ruling class threatened by Gaetanismo had been saved. The country that emerged from that catastrophe was not, however, the same. Millions of peasants expelled by the violence came to the cities seeking to escape terror and ruin. What Gaetan had tried to prevent was accomplished in the face of the indifference of the powerful and the coldness of the scholars. The pattern of land ownership had changed, landowners had fished in a troubled river, the urban population and peasant population indices had been inverted, cities were growing uncontrollably, Colombia had far fewer owners than before, and a dark future of misery and unemployment loomed over the new urban crowds. In this panorama, the National Front showed the country its innovations. As if the danger to Colombia were not the traditional parties that had bled her to death, and openly brandishing the threat of a possible return of the violence that only they could provoke, she distributed power between liberals and conservatives and prohibited any political opposition from the legal framework. It confirmed the state, predictably, as an instrument to guarantee privileges. It only allowed economic initiative in the sphere of classes, families, and companies traditionally related to power, and closed the possibilities of access to wealth to the enterprising middle classes, persisting in the policy of denying credit and capitalization to the classes humble. Finally, it was unable to guarantee sources of work for the crowds that continued to arrive in the large urban centers. It closed the possibility of access to minimum standards of living and minimum conditions of dignity for the poor, and allowed the growth and proliferation of labor belts. Misery around the cities, and persisted in the old stately attitude of not considering that the state had duties towards the poor, so that it was enough to stimulate private charity campaigns. No one could notice then that in the rise of campaigns such as El Matuto de Dios, the charitable farms and the telethon, with enormous deployment and diffusion, what was hidden was the inability or indifference of the state to fulfill priority social duties, and their growing habit of leaving in the hands of individuals not the solution, but the effort to mitigate the tragedies of poverty and social disorder. Everything that we are socially since then is the result of the National Front. Sensitive sectors deplored it in his time as a great defeat. A section of liberalism, the MRL, fought it vigorously, as did the literary movement of the Nadaists. There are memorable pages by Gonzalo Arango in which he tells that Nadaísmo existed because Gaetan had died, that a rebellious and eccentric movement like Nadaísmo had been necessary because the hope of a people had been destroyed, and that if Gaetan had triumphed the Nadaístas would have been normal young people dedicated to building a great country with him. But at the time, Colombians did not realize the terrible evil that the aristocratic pact represented for Colombia, by which the popular right to express themselves politically was officially buried. Now it is incredible to us that one could speak of democracy while the existence of political parties other than the official ones was expressly prohibited. While the country was condemned to a bipartisanism that was also purely apparent, since for a long time the words liberal and conservative had lost in Colombia all programmatic content, all traces of a thought or an idea, and had been debased until they were only two hereditary ways of hating others. After the Cuban Revolution, hemispheric politics demanded that Latin American armies change their border defense priorities to what they called internal security. Thus was institutionalized one of the most aberrant phenomena of the century. When our countries required access to real democracy and mature politically, a perverse theory according to which Latin Americans were not mature for democracy, guiltily supported by North American governments, allowed Latin America to live one of its darkest times. A progression of anti-popular military dictatorships made its way to guarantee the application of economic policies on the continent and to silence demands for social justice and the free exercise of the opposition, without which democracy is inconceivable. Interestingly, Colombia had experienced the phenomenon of an almost accidental military dictatorship that, imposed in the mid-1950s by a coalition of traditional parties as a kind of rehearsal of what the National Front would become, deviated from its original purpose when the dictator, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, understood that the state, made to defend certain privileges from time to time, could serve other purposes. There was a curious amalgamation of charitable works for the people and the use of power for their own benefit, which, of course, provoked a quick reaction from the political class that had been the inspiration for the experiment. It is worth remembering that the main modernization works that Colombia undertook in the middle of the century were the result of this almost involuntary pattern in the petty domination of the elites, and that in an atmosphere so rarefied by the selfishness of the powerful, not even the army was a safe ally. The general got out of hand to such an extent that 10 years later he was the protagonist of an electoral adventure that endangered bipartisan domination, and forced the democratic government of the National Front to modify the electoral results at the last minute, with figures arrivals from remote provinces. Also in Gayton's time there had been the phenomenon that the police, made up of people from the town, ended up becoming Gaytonista, to the dismay of the owners of power. These experiences aroused a great distrust of the powerful in the initiative of their armed forces, and with great intelligence it was tried that the military leaders amassed great fortunes, managed immense budgets, had control of the citizenship and even justice, and enjoyed excessive privileges, but they were not let go of the helm of the state even in the days when Colombia was one of the very few boats with a democratic appearance in an ocean of sabers. Those 20 years of the National Front brought some of the greatest evils of current Colombian society, evils that were added to the many that we already dragged from the old days, to conform the picture of helplessness and despair that we now have before our eyes. As all legal opposition was prohibited, something that can only happen in the most brutal dictatorships, the illegal opposition emerged and was strengthened, the armed opposition, which has grown to own half the country. For a long time the ideologues of power explained the existence of the guerrillas as a product of the infiltration of foreign ideologies, particularly the international communist movement. They explained it this way despite knowing that in Colombia, as Hobsbawm has said, there were always men in arms in the fields and the practice of small-scale focused rebellion and rural banditry is a tradition. But many of the Colombian guerrillas were not strictly communists, or only dressed in that clothing while the world boom of that ideology lasted, and instead we have all been able to verify that the silence of the Castroist discourse and the overwhelming fall of the Soviet Union and the gradual incorporation of China into the market economy not only did not precipitate the end of the Colombian guerrilla, but also went hand in hand with its unusual rise in our territory. Despite its banditry and its lack of communication with society, the guerrilla is not a police case, it is not a military problem but a political problem, and therefore it is obvious that the more it is fought and the more it is invest money in military resources against it, the stronger it becomes. Who is unaware that the Colombian countryside is ruined? That the country offers no alternative, no future, to the rural inhabitants? With what face does this state come to tell us that the peasants have no reason to rebel, when even professionals in Colombia have to get into taxi drivers, and any claim, no matter how fair, is practically prohibited? Let us prohibit in France the claims of citizenship, the right to indignation, and the sovereign right of French workers to shake their institutions, and they will not only make guerrillas but another head-cutter revolution, because in France they do know that being a citizen is fundamentally not letting yourself be trampled on by anyone, especially if you are the one who pays them their salary. I maintain that it is the prevailing Colombian state, with its inefficiency and its disrespect for the demands of the citizens, which forces the peasants to adhere to those armed movements that have no future, but at least have a present. The National Front also closed access to wealth for the entrepreneurial middle classes, and they were therefore pushed towards illicit activities such as smuggling and drug trafficking, since if a society denies legal possibilities within the framework of economic democracy, those who aspire to wealth have only the path of illegality. A certain Babylonian king, in a story by Voltaire, desperately consults the oracle because his daughter the princess has eloped with a vagabond, and the oracle responds with these words: "When one does not marry the girls, your majesty, the girls marry alone." This was what happened in Colombia since the early 1970s. The old manorial ideology had imposed the absurd logic here that any concession to the poor is a scandal. To be rich, the only condition was to have had the precaution of being rich from the cradle, and everything else was a preposterous and ridiculous pretense. This is even stranger if we think that our ruling class, by a tricky somersault, abandoned the old medieval theory of the nobility of blood and pretended to adopt the principles of liberal democracy due to the French Revolution. All this was very well seen in the lyrics, but that the servants did not seek to go overboard, or attempt embarrassing scenes. It is very difficult to sustain a stately, racist, exclusive and mean society, in which terms such as good people, people from a good family survive, and at the same time varnish it with a liberal discourse haloed by the claim that all are equal before the law and live under the rule of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. People will end up believing that they really have rights and may even try to enforce them. And this is aggravated if the economic model exposes people to the discourse of the metropolises, since they will slowly begin to perceive that the model that is preached to them is very little like the one that is offered to them. There to the north was the United States, with its respect for the citizen, its equal rights, its decent wages, its opportunities for employment and consumption, and here we lived in a crazy consumer society in which even the middle classes had to think about it many times to buy what they saw in the shop windows. You can play like that with people, but not with everyone. Sooner or later someone will feel like they are cheating in the game and they will discover that they too can cheat. It is already known that the only pedagogy is the pedagogy of example, and a state cannot demand that the law be respected if it does not respect it itself. Governing according to a privileged few, looting the public treasury, abusing authority, is violating the law in a serious way, and can generate in the conscience of some the feeling that if those in charge of applying it violate the law, it cannot be so serious that individuals violate it. But it is also the case that the public discourse of industrial society, that is, advertising, proclaims in all possible tones that the only condition worthy of admiration and respect is wealth. The messages of cars and perfumes and cigarettes and credit cards display that refined vulgarity as the necessary condition of all success and all happiness. And the poor spectator discovers that they are selling him the torture of Tantalus, that, eager to be rich, to obey the melodious orders of the media and to deserve respect for their human condition, society does not allow it because it is organized to prevent all promotion, to perpetuate the rich in their wealth and let them poor people die at the doors of hospitals. And he also discovers that the only ones in the vast world who seem to have the obligation to show themselves exemplary and virtuous are those who are condemned to live in the bilges, to suffer like good poor the labyrinths of bureaucracy and the heels of the law on the nape of the neck. It really does not seem strange to me that in a situation like that, some man is the victim of bad thoughts and begins to fantasize about less virtuous but more possible fortunes. If the state does not provide guarantees to the citizen, how can it reproach them for resorting to irregular methods to guarantee their subsistence? The National Front excluded the humble people, and we have seen the material and moral misery of the country grow in a colossal way. When the state makes an effort to do things for the benefit of the poor, it does everything in a begging and external way, because the poor are not represented in the state, and the state badly tries to mitigate the conditions of poverty, but it is not a compromised instance with real solutions for that population. And it is not a significant minority, it is, according to the figures, half of the national population. One wonders, in function of who governs the state, if its first priority is not the problem of poverty, through which the entire society has plunged into chaos. Of that gigantic mass of exiled human beings, excluded from that infrahumanity, many have been forced into crime. Today the main source of crime in Colombian society is common crime, not guerrilla crime or drug trafficking crime, but common crime, the daughter of ignorance, resentment, poverty, subhuman living conditions and, of course, strengthened and perpetuated by impunity. Even without making the changes that Colombia urgently requires to become the country with dignity that we want, even without that great revolution of dignity against misery and against exclusion, it would be an advance for the state to heal the three very serious wounds that it inflicted on society with the scheme of the National Front. The prohibition of illegal opposition, the lack of economic democracy, the lack of a true commitment to the poorer classes. Only a truly active and effective legal opposition can render the harmful armed opposition, with its capacity for extortion and terrorism, useless and unjustified. Only access to economic initiative and social advancement can allow the terrible situation of the middle classes to be overcome, day by day forced to persist in the not easy accumulation of illegal wealth. Only a policy aimed at capitalizing the poor, guaranteeing them conditions of dignity and decent living standards, only their access to a living relationship with language and culture, can considerably reduce the levels of crime and common delinquency in Colombia. The guerrillas, drug trafficking and common crime cannot be averted with mere police solutions. Their disappearance does not depend on a very expensive policy of war. War can serve to justify gigantic budgets, but not to achieve reconciliation or the effective overcoming of these conflicts. The case of Colombian society in the last 50 years is the case of a criminal state that criminalized the country. Because the main consequence of the National Front is that, with the abolition of all opposition, all citizen surveillance, the state became a nest of corruption, a den of uncontrolled appetites between two complicit parties that did not admit any oversight. By a very different path, curiously, Mexico reached a similar situation. Just as there the existence of a single party, without possible opposition, was corrupting the state until it became a nest of bureaucrats without guts and ambitious without scruples, so also our dictatorship of a single party, with two heads and with two colors, turned the state into an efficient mass of corruption, continually confronted with itself, to which no budget is enough, where each small official manipulates the law at will with impunity, and where a vast network of compadres and friends parasitic on chaos, and he squeezes everyone who falls into his hands. From the highest to the lowest levels, influence peddling is the norm. Now, can this long list of causes explain why our society is unable to react and change a situation that has become intolerable? Being abused is not a merit, Bernard Shaw told a visitor who listed his woes. I have referred to the precedents of our situation, but the purpose of these pages is to think about the future and to dare reflections on the new republic, as Gayton called it, which we have a duty to build. A republic capable of overcoming a long history of negligence and crime, capable of offering the world something better than a recurring memorial of grievances. The national project so many times postponed has to rise again, until sanity and nobility of heart prevail in the same scenario where today the deniers of the country and the destroyers of its hope persist. Every memory is sad and every foreboding is happy, Novalis said. The most immediate duty of Colombia is to anticipate that future and to take possession of it with passion and conviction. The old ruling castes have deposed themselves, made themselves unworthy of respect, and I don't think they deserve a place in history. It is time for us to ask ourselves what is our place, what is our role and our destiny. In all this time, citizen passivity, indifference, and fear have grown. But in the last 50 years there have also been great processes of social initiative, of struggle for the rights of the community, proud and dignified expressions. What happened to the Colombian trade union movement? What happened to the courageous claims of the peasants? What happened to the student mobilizations? It is shocking to think that while in every democratic country the right to claim, indignation, and resistance to oppression are pillars of social life, here all popular outrage is the cause of fierce persecution. Legal access to wealth is prevented in practice, all enrichment is illicit, as well as all resistance and all claims are automatically illegal. We are talking about ignoble times. It is one thing to take to the streets, as in France, knowing that the state respects the population and responds for its legitimacy, knowing that if official force were used illegally against the people it would be severely sanctioned, and another to take to the streets to claim knowing that after the peaceful marches, when the dispersed protesters return home alone, there are silent disappearances and anonymous executions. A people incapable of facing evil deserves its prostration and its anguish. But when one wonders where are those who protested, those who rebelled, those who demanded, those who believed they had the right to demand a fairer, more respectful country, thought darkens. Heroes are in cemeteries, a voice whispers in our ear. And then we remember that theatrical piece in which a character exclaims, "Unfortunate is the country that has no heroes," and another responds, "No, unfortunate is the country that needs them." Colombia has already had many heroes, but the sad thing is that it needs them, because the injustice being evident, the monstrous contrast between those who have a lot and those who have nothing is evident, corruption and crime being evident, the incredible extermination of an entire opposition political party, the streets populated by homeless people that gangs of rich boys go out to murder at night, the abandonment of the fields being evident, the bankruptcy of national companies in the name of modernization, being evident that half of the country does not seem to deserve respect or future, saying it is illegal and fighting it can be deadly. The owners of power in Colombia seem willing to sacrifice anything in order to preserve their privileges. Their hand did not tremble to make the old peasant country tear itself apart in a conflict that they could have prevented with a little patriotic awareness, generosity, and foresight. The emergence of the communist guerrillas at the beginning of the 1960s made them think that any concession would mean sacrificing their wealth, and the war to the death against the revolutionary left was since then the only slogan of the governments and the leaders of public opinion. The communist ideology made a whole generation of young people think that it was about violently overthrowing the elites to transform society into a dictatorship in the Soviet or Cuban way, and subordinated the efforts to transform society to the repetition of these formulas with which Russian society passed from the Tsarist autocracy to the statist dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. This prevented our country from following the path that Gaydon had wisely traced for it, the search for its own destiny that would consult its nature, its uniqueness, its richness of nuances and cultures. The communist sects fed here on the old scholastic, parasitic, dependent tradition, and also when it sought solutions to its drama, Colombia persisted in the dogmatic cult of illustrious models and borrowed formulas. Our belonging to the European mental order is undeniable. A country whose language is the daughter of Latin and Greek, who has professed for centuries a religion of Hebrew, Greek, and Roman origin, that the democratic model has been proposed due to the French Revolution and that he claims to be a defender of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a society that has formed institutions following the European liberal model cannot claim to find solutions ignoring that tradition. Democracy continues to be a promise for us, and we still need in Colombia a lucid, vigorous, implacable critique of the iniquities of the prevailing power, such as the one Voltaire undertook in his day, and a serious proposal of good sense, logic, generosity, and of civil value. What we need is to understand that it is one thing to be children of Europe and another to be confused with it, when we belong to such a different territory, when we owe deep respect to the old parents who populated this territory for centuries and from whom we also descend, when we know that the diversity of our natural, ethnic, and cultural composition is a privilege, and does not allow the arbitrary imposition of a single model, a single truth, a single aesthetic. No country will ever be able to build a just and balanced social order if it is not capable of recognizing itself and designing its economic, political, and cultural project based on that awareness of its possibilities and its limitations. A common joke is that in Colombia the rich want to be English, the intellectuals want to be French, the middle class wants to be American, and the poor want to be Mexican. After centuries of a shameful and snobbish effort to pretend to be what we are not, it is urgent to discover what Colombia is, that a thought arises between us, an interpretation of ourselves, an alternative of social order, of development, a dream that resembles what we are. The main enemy of that dream is the paradoxical clamor of the defenders of the existing chaos who seek to deny the pool of blood in which we live and the absolute failure of this model in its duty to provide, since no happiness, even minimal dignity to the population. Those incomprehensible that editorial after editorial show us four abstract figures of prosperity to show us that we live in paradise. Who will deny that many live in conditions of opulence difficult to imagine? Who will deny that those who strive to silence the dissatisfaction and indignation of conscientious Colombians have every reason to defend what exists? If we cannot propose something, it is to convince 3 million people who live splendidly that the country is bad. Fortified walls and gates with electronic keys and private armies of guardians and mastiffs almost authorize them to say that this is a safe country. And neither can we make the 5 million who wake up struggling to access that exquisite circle accept that the exclusionary social model has failed, although every day they feel the languages of chaos closer. High income and letters of credit and clubs and luxurious shopping centers where you can live for a while like in New York, and where the violence of the miserable and the brutality of the mafias has not yet reached, guarantee the convenience of the model. They do not wonder why well-to-do people in other countries do not have to settle for small residential and commercial ghettos but can walk through their cities and their countryside fully enjoying the world. They have resigned themselves to living behind the walls and they are not unaware that something is rotten in the world that they so jealously defend. But gradually the country has become inhospitable and difficult even for those who always profited from it. The postponement of the reforms and the resignation of the national project have affected the population so much that even the owners of power are complaining about the country they made. Today there are more than 400 kidnapped people in the territory, and the news presenters wake us up in the morning to the nightmare of remembering that we live in a country besieged by guerrillas, drug traffickers, paramilitaries, self-defense groups, popular militias, and common criminals. The owners of the country have to be alarmed at this that they have not been able to avoid with their power. Those millions and millions of pesos that were never able to invest in avoiding the evils of poverty, they have to spend on weapons to repress the children of resentment and misery. As is their custom, they forget that they always had the right and the power to do and undo as they pleased, and accuse the people of being the cause of chaos. We read in the big newspapers, whose persistent effort to hide the horror and whose guilty resignation to being the critical conscience of society have for decades been the sedative of public opinion, that the country has lost its values, that morality has deteriorated and good manners. But, as Bernard Shaw said, there are times when the people do not need more morals but more money. Having something to eat with does not guarantee that someone will behave, but not having it frankly demands that one behave badly. Those responsible for the drama are beginning to demand that the victims fix what greed has damaged, exactly in the way that now the manufacturers of non-biodegradable garbage propose that instead of them stopping production, the towns carry out periodic cleaning crusades for fields, beaches, and rivers of the planet. The old strategy is to privatize profits well, and vastly socialize losses. Sometimes they admit that things are wrong, but are immediately outraged that people are trying to find responsible people. Why look for a culprit? They wonder. Why not assume that history has brought us to this and that now we have to solve it together? The truth is that correcting evils requires discovering where the causes lie, since any historical project that seeks to eradicate evils without knowing their source is doomed to failure. Our foolish mental model is in that sinister comic. The best critic of this model, Stanislaw Zuleta, used to say that the causes of things should not be confused with the conditions that make them possible. For example, he said, if you are told that someone committed suicide by throwing himself off an 8th floor, and you are asked what was the cause of that death, you do not answer that the law of gravity. Well, in Colombia we continually confuse the causes of things with the conditions that make them possible. If a couple of hitmen assassinate someone from a motorcycle, the next day we ban motorcycles. In the same way, we confuse causes with effects. We believe that by altering the effects we correct the causes. Generalized common crime is the daughter of poverty and exclusion, but there is always someone interested in ending crime without altering those conditions of injustice at all. Drug trafficking is the result of a situation in which honest work does not even allow survival, while illegal work is paid copiously by an opulent empire. There is always someone who wants to dissipate the effect without modifying the cause at all. The proliferation of street vendors is the result of the lack of formal alternatives for survival. There is always someone who believes that the solution is to throw them out to the police or lock them in basements where they cannot compete. And the mental misery of some is so serious that one seriously thinks that the cause of poverty is that there are poor people, and that therefore the solution is to end them, yes, at midnight and in the dark. Curiously, there are culprits there. Those who insist all day in denying that the responsibility for social ills can be attributed to the privileged, the only ones who had in their hands the possibility of humanizing the model a bit, are always ready to shout that the blame for the poverty is in the poor, the guilt of delinquency in criminals and the guilt of the hitmen on the motorcycles that lead them to carry out their crimes. And they will never accept that if a society has 35 million inhabitants and all its wealth is in the hands of 5, the other 30 have been expropriated. Okay, that's life. But if those 5 who own everything do not make an effort to ensure that their society is minimally viable for others, and are locked in a sick and fascist selfishness, with what right can they protest when it is their turn to be expropriated, in the merciless hour of the resentful and their machetes? My humble opinion, but there are those who assure that it is not like that, is that that dreadful hour is closer than many imagine, and that, as Shakespeare would say, selfishness is sharpening a knife destined for its own neck. Evil is working, nobody does anything to stop it. Colombia has more crimes every year than the previous one, more kidnappings, more extortion, more corruption, more inequality, and official voices seem to agree that, if someone is dissatisfied, then to take care of fixing things. Maybe they are right. Perhaps the time has come when it is the communities, and not the causes of evil, who apply themselves to the task of solving it. Even, perhaps the time has come when, despite these long and necessary analyses of the causes of our crisis, society must assume responsibility for what is happening and undertake the task of changing it. Until now, the acceptance that there was a ruling class, aware of the nation's direction, capable of designing economic policies, development models, cultural plans, has allowed society to fall asleep in indifference or assume the role equally pitiful to demand solutions or receive alms. But once the catastrophic failure of these elites, their parties, and their speeches has been demonstrated, shouldn't society assume that its duty is to provide solutions instead of demanding or imploring them? Each citizen must be able to say to himself, "What I do not solve, I have no right to expect someone else to solve it for me." And consequently assume that the mere claim and the mere request are as submissive ways of being in the world as indifference or cowardly silence. Isn't it time to not ask or expect anything, to build a different model? Isn't the civil disobedience proposal that Thoreau reasoned a century and a half ago beginning to make sense and function? Does this mean leaving the state in the hands of corrupt politicians, the economy in the hands of the world market, the streets in the hands of the underworld? Given this, there are several alternatives. Either one accepts the state, believes in its legitimacy, and to that extent trusts it, respects its rules, participates in elections, supports its points of view and struggles to impose them, or one does not accept the legitimacy of the state, one organizes outside of it or against it, and fights for the establishment of a state in which they can believe and trust, or one does not believe in the validity of any state, and is organized to survive in the jungle of the world without assuming a social contract and rules of coexistence. I honestly do not believe that Colombian society can survive in its diversity and complexity, with expectations of a dignified life, in the current state, with its petty assumptions, its bureaucratic mass, its irresponsible legalism and its corruption, and at the same time I do not believe that we can renounce the existence of a state that minimally regulates social coexistence and guarantees conditions for private initiative, economic regulation, application of the law, the primacy of the common interest over private interests, protection of the inviolable realm of individual freedom. What makes our society not react? Perhaps the same thing that made two men of the town raise their axes against Rafael Uribe, that a man of the town assassinated Jorge Eliar Gayton, that during the violence the poor of the Blue Party were enemies of the poor of the Red Party and cut their throats by the color of the scarf. What paralyzes us is that a single language always prevailed in our society, the one that Gayton tried to eradicate from the soul of the people, that exclusive and stately discourse that repeats that a few are legitimately owners and spokesmen for the country, and that all the rest are the insignificant mob, the rabble. It is the dissociative discourse that excludes everything that is not part of the circle of privileges. The economic discourse that claims that the country's situation is measured by the figures of inflation, economic growth, gross domestic product or the exchange rate, and not by the true living conditions of specific individuals. The discourse that continues to maintain, as during the previous 2 centuries, that the only valid models are those dictated by the metropolises, and that we have no right to propose alternatives, because our duty is to be docile replicas of what others invent. That speech has replaced the reality of hunger and blood with a spectrum of figures, polls, and averages. That speech proclaims itself happy because this end of the year there were 297 crimes and not 302 like last year. That speech repeats to us endlessly that we live in the best of worlds, that Colombia is one of the most perfect democracies that exist. Certain newspapers are designed to make us feel that everything is fine, that the economy is booming, that economic growth was considerable, that the authorities report normality, that Colombia is a country of self-sacrificing but happy beings, who face inexplicable adversity with optimism and with faith in the future, and that in reality our evils consist in that there are a few bandits that the police will already take care of. It is considered scaremongering to say that in Bogotá people are afraid of getting on buses due to the possibility of a robbery, that nobody wants to go out on the streets at night because citizens lost the right to public spaces, that having a car is as dangerous as walking through the alleys, that every day we hear stories of families that have been looted and gagged by the underworld in extreme conditions of impunity, that there are people working shifts for minimum wage, that there are department capitals without drinking water, that no one feels summoned by a project of society, that young people are stunned to enjoy the present without questions and without thoughts because nobody believes in the future, except for 4 gentlemen of industry and their spokesman in the media. They have to make an effort to combine objective information, often lurid, with entertaining shows that mitigate the devastating effect of the real country that is close to us and for which no one seems to have solutions, and we have reached the extreme that seeing alarming things is pessimism. Optimism consists in saying by obligation that everything is going well and will be better, and mentioning the evils has become more objectionable than the evils themselves. It is urgent to say goodbye in Colombia to the double conservative Liberal Party, whose 2 heads are always in disagreement on the petty minutiae of the deal and always in agreement on the general logic of ambition and plunder. After having ruined the country, they continue to shuffle the names of the mediocrities that will rule us in the next century. They did not build a nation, an industry, a culture, an art, a science, a philosophy, even the beautiful examples of their architecture they demolished themselves out of greed, to sell the lots to the highest bidder. They spent their historic moment in sterile drills and despised all that Colombia had to offer the world. They turned us into a poor subaltern country of ganapanes and imitators, but something profound and sacred prevented that process from being complete. Perhaps this territory whose natural wealth continues to amaze visitors, this authentic Creole cultural wealth that is becoming more and more important and more vigorous. We must extract our poetry from the future, but without forgetting that, as Garcia Marquez says, and as Gaydon thought, one is not where fashions come from, but where graves are sown. Those Colombian generations who made this a mestizo and mulatto soil, a Creole soil, where we must seek our way of being, the face of Colombia that the world will learn to respect and love. But that new country is not a mere dream projected into the ungraspable future but a reality that has been built for years and years. That new republic is alive in thousands and thousands of efforts that interpret the country differently, that open channels of expression for the vast strip of Colombians excluded by the moral misery of the ruling classes. None of the great patriotic dreams, none of the components of the presumed national project can be forgotten by the new country that is born on the ruins of the factious bipartisanship and its delinquent state. There are, alive, 60 indigenous nations with their mythologies, their languages, their transcendental philosophies of respect for nature and of harmony with the natural universe, with their music, their dances, their clothing, their ornaments, their rituals, their ancestral wisdom. Its medicine and its magic, its arts and crafts. There is the admirable epic of Don Juan de Castellanos, who meticulously narrated the process of the conquest of New Granada, a work full of information about our elders of different races and cultures, one of the very few poetic works of our tradition that names the territory with admiration and reverence, one of the few in which native peoples exist, with its complexity, its violence, and its heroism. There is the challenging example of the botanical expedition, the memory of its naturalists and painters, as well as a memorable stretch of the expedition of Aimé Bonpland and Alexander von Humboldt. There is the example of heroes like José María Carbonell, who really believed in the possibility of political autonomy and spiritual independence from the oppressive power of the metropolis. There are the examples of José Hilario López, Tomás Cipriano de Mosquera, and all those, many belonging to the traditional ruling classes, who believed in the country and sought its greatness with true love for the territory and true respect for its people. There is the example of the Chorographic Commission, Jorge Isaac's double physical and literary journey discovering the richness and beauty of the American tropics, the thought of Rafael Uribe and the exploratory trips of Rafael Reyes. There is the surprising linguistic adventure of Rufino José Cuervo and the remarkable critical work of Baldomero Saninquino. There they are the founding saga of the Antioquinos, the saga of the railroads, the dream of a national economy that since the 1920s proposed us a different destiny, the legendary adventure of sailing on the Magdalena, the mental and verbal adventure of José Eustaquio Rivera exploring Casanare and the jungle, and denouncing the hell of the rubber factories. There is the work of Porfirio Barba Jacob, his life as a rebel, an adventurer, a dreamer, and a continental man, the respectable liberal project of Alfonso López Pumarejo and his revolution on the move, the citizen example, the mysterious eloquence and the lucid political ideology of the greatest leader of the century, Jorge Elías Gayton. There are the combativeness and integrity of Maria Cano and Ignacio Torres Giraldo, the fight of the banana martyrs, the Daniel Samper Ortega Village Library, and his generous intellectual project. There is the lucid, original, audacious work, and deeply committed to the country, of the teacher Fernando González. There is the example of the great popular leaders of the MRL, the example of Alfonso Barberena fighting in the neighborhoods for the crowds that came fleeing the violence. There is the work of Gabriel García Márquez, who made Colombia enter universal letters, and there is the Edenic poetry of Aurelio Arturo. There are the great labor movements of the 60s, the aesthetic movement promoted by Marta Truba, and the great intellectual effort promoted by Jorge Gayton Durán and the magazine Mito. There is the generous example of Camilo Torres Restrepo, capable of giving everything for his convictions. There is Nadaísmo, expression of youthful rebellion in an unforgettable decade, renovating literary language and critical awareness of its time. There is the long and enriching cultural effort of the magazine Echo to keep alive the links between our culture and the great Western tradition. There is the effort of Luis Carlos Galán to dignify politics. There is the popular music of Carlos Vico and Tartarin Morera, Guillermo Buitrago and Lucho Bermúdez, José A. Morales and Jorge Villamil, the inspired maestro José Barros and Carlos Washington Andrade, Crescencio Salcido, and the Vallenato minstrels. There is the intense and patient philosophical work of Danilo Cruz Velez, and the reflective genius and aesthetic pedagogy of Estanislao Zuleta, who opened our thinking to the horizons of modernity. The work that has been done is great and the work that remains to be done is great, but it is possible that Colombia, without knowing it very well, without even telling itself, has long ago undertaken the task of promoting a transformation that cannot be thwarted. By the bullets of greed their majorities long ago renounced their faith in the leaders and in the parties, but important sectors of the population, departing from the arrogant and anti-national world that governed us, have dedicated themselves to the fruitful and lasting work of recognizing themselves in the country and building a project that cannot be undermined by libel or crime. A different consciousness has been growing that cannot be situated or silenced, because it is everywhere. It is in the admirable and generous work of Gerardo Reichel Dalmatov, who revealed to us the amazing worlds of mystery and wisdom of the indigenous peoples that our official culture had always considered wild and primitive. It is in the persistent work of anthropologists and sociologists, of biologists and engineers, of doctors and researchers who, like the members of the old botanical expedition, do not ignore the political implications of their work. They do not ignore that their effort is part of the search for a better destination for Colombia. It is in the growing work of writers and artists, of philosophers and psychologists, of historians and architects, of scientists and technicians whose silent rebellion is in the will to build a knowledge that is due to us and that solves problems of our reality. Next to the country of privileges, the corrupt state and its politicians, next to guerrilla and state violence, the mafia and the underworld, next to torture and summary executions, political massacres and cynicism's electoral elections, that other country has been growing, which is no longer deceived by the selfish economic powers and their spokesmen in the media. From that indignant but responsible and creative country, from that country that is not news, the future that Colombia deserves must emerge. But that country in formation is not yet integrated into a national project. Their efforts grew isolated, and that is why the nation where the civilizing rebellion is brewing, called to finally change the protagonists of Colombian history, still produces the sensation of being only a protracted disaster in silent movies. Yet that plural thought has not coalesced into a language that allows us to enter into a creative dialogue with each other. The suspicious, factual, and exclusive language that they taught us still prevails, but in countless citizens there is already the seed of that new republic, united in its ethnic and cultural complexity, and at the same time respectful of their differences. In the most recent admirable testimonial literature, after 50 years of silence, townspeople who were protagonists of a tremendous story have begun to reconstruct their destiny through a living language full of revelations. Instead of thinking about mastering it and managing it, many Colombians are questioning and thinking about the country. After the valuable regional days of culture, the joyful effort of the communities allowed to save another dignifying and fruitful cultural convocation, the CREA program, an expedition through Colombian culture, supported blindly by various administrations without understanding its value very well, and that he came to surprise us with the richness, diversity, and vitality of our present culture. The new country grows in the work of regional industries and cooperatives, of solidarity companies, of ecological movements, alternative media, of literary, artistic, and musical events of world significance achieved thanks to the private initiative in several cities, in the dignity of a new generation of responsible and courageous journalists, in music and dance creators who have turned to the sources of their own culture to find a language in which to originally speak to the world, in the work of groups and individuals committed to the country, who do not have the slightest desire to launch themselves into the conquest of power, or who, having known the paralyzing networks of its enormous Kafkaesque labyrinth, already know how impossible it is to change something in the haze nightmare of the incised and the deceased. Only by taking possession of that multiple and cohesive language that gives a new meaning to the nation and its history, will we be able to form a movement capable, not of claiming or asking, but of provoking the great social changes that the country requires and propose a viable life in the field of contemporary possibilities. To carry out a revolution that cannot be stopped and thwarted by bullets, the union of intelligence, creativity, and the solidarity of millions of human beings is required, of those who already know that the existing power is only looking for a future for that meager minority that is ashamed of its compatriots and that systematically despises and excludes them. A country that is formidable in terms of resources and capable of large companies is in a position to be born. It is enough for us Colombians to allow ourselves to be aware of our strength, to be the proud spokesmen of our territory, the defenders of our nature and the insightful children of a history that lies in oblivion. Today it is no longer a question of reaching heaven but of getting out of hell, a hell of intolerance and helplessness circumscribed by history to the line of our borders. But it will be enough to take that initial step that takes us from the horrors so that it is already possible to dream of the country that Colombia, taught by its history, can become. Sooner or later we will have to think, not of an isolated and independent economy, which is impossible, but of an economy whose first priority is the Colombian people. I dream of a country that is physically and spiritually united with the other countries of South America. That a group of young Venezuelans or Colombians can take the train in Caracas or Bogotá and travel, if they want to the confines of Buenos Aires. In a world where highways are built from island to island, it should not be impossible to lay down that path of unity between sister nations. I dream of a country that when it speaks of development, it speaks of development for all, and not at the expense of the planet but also thinking about the world that future generations will inhabit, that when he talks about national industry he knows how to remember, like Gayton, that the industry is equally the employers, the workers, and the consumers. I dream of a country aware of its lands, its trees, its seas, and its creatures, where to speak of the economy is to speak of how the last of the Republic's children lives. I dream of a country where it is impossible for people to sleep under bridges or eat garbage in the streets. I dream of a country whose currency can be shown and traded anywhere on the planet. I dream of a country that wins medals at the Olympic Games. I dream of a country of beautiful and dignified towns and cities, where those who have more feel the pride and tranquility of knowing that others live with dignity. I dream of an intelligent country, that is, a country where everyone knows that we all need everyone, that the night can surprise us anywhere, that the car can strand us on the lonely high roads, and that is why it is good that we strive to sow friendship and not resentment. I dream of a country where an Indian can not only be an Indian with pride, but overcoming this era in which he is wanted to be educated in the errors of European civilization, let us learn with respect his profound knowledge of harmony with the cosmos and conservation of nature. I dream of a country where so many talented artists, musicians and dancers, actors and poets, painters and storytellers, stop being picturesque and marginal figures, and become proud spokesmen for a nation, the creators of its traditions. All that just requires the passionate and festive building of sincere and courageous bonds. And there is a question that history is asking us, now that red and blue are no longer a path, where is the yellow strip? And where is the yellow fringe? William Ospina.